Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a word that feels simple, maybe even a bit dry. Accountability. It sounds like you know what it means, right? Just, well, being accountable.
Sure.
But dive even a little deeper, and you find it's often tangled up with another concept, responsibility, in ways that can be surprisingly confusing, maybe even hazardous.
That's exactly right. And our deep dive today is based on a really interesting source text. It looks at accountability not just, theoretically, but through the lens of lived experience.
Okay.
It focuses specifically on the maritime industry and its safety management systems, SMS, basically.
Yeah.
How ships and shipping companies try to keep things safe.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack the nuances of accountability that this text uncovered. We want to see how it affects, our decision-making, our sense of identity, maybe how we learn from mistakes, and how all of this plays out in a really high-stakes, real-world system like maritime safety.
Let's start right at the core of the issue then, which the source text highlights immediately. That confusion between accountability and responsibility. It's everywhere.
Yeah, you see them used interchangeably all the time. The text points to the Oxford English Dictionary definitions from 2024, and it reveals something quite interesting about the language itself.
It does. Responsibility is defined in several ways. Being capable of fulfilling an obligation, being reliable, trustworthy, all that.
Okay.
But one part of the definition explicitly says it's the state or fact of being accountable. Liability. So responsibility actually includes accountability in its definition.
Huh. Okay, so responsibility is the bigger umbrella term, and accountability fits underneath it. What about accountability itself, then? How's that defined?
Well, this is where it gets tricky. The definition for accountability is given as simply the fact or state of being accountable, responsible.
Wait, so it just points back?
Exactly. The source, citing some researchers, calls this a circular definition. One word defines the other, which defines the first one right back.
It's like defining up as the opposite of down, and down as the opposite of up. Sort of helpful, but doesn't really pin it down.
Precisely. And the text really emphasizes this isn't just like a linguistic puzzle for academics. This circularity, this confusion, can be particularly hazardous.
Hazardous how?
Especially for people who aren't native English speakers, trying to navigate really complex systems, legal frameworks, where these terms are absolutely critical. The language itself can actually be a barrier to clear understanding.
Wow. Okay, so let's park the definitional loop for a second. How does this idea of accountability actually affect us? Like how we think, how we make decisions?
Yeah, the source dives into this using ideas from cognitive psychology. It suggests we can process accountability in broadly two main ways. One is very analytical, almost calculative, looking at a situation quite abstractly.
Like a formula or something. And the other way?
The other is more narrative, seeing the situation as a story, a sequence of events that has meaning. But where it gets really interesting, I think, is how different types of accountability seem to influence our actual decision strategies.
Different types? What do you mean?
Yes. Specifically, whether you feel accountable mainly for the outcome of a decision, the end result, or for the process you followed to get to that decision.
Ah, okay. Outcome versus process.
Exactly. And research cited in the source suggests that if you're only focused on the outcome, it can kind of oversimplify your decision making. It can mess with your calibration.
Calibration.
Yeah, that's basically how well your confidence in a judgment matches its actual accuracy. Outcome focus can lower that calibration. It can also lead to more inconsistent decisions over time.
And I can see how that might lead to just freezing up, doing nothing, if you're terrified of a bad outcome and getting blamed for it.
Precisely. You might avoid making the necessary call because you can't guarantee a perfect result. Yeah, you have to defend.
Defend yourself later if it goes wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But if you feel accountable for the process, for how you arrive at the decision, the steps you took, the information you weighed up, the research, suggests this encourages a more thorough, more even evaluation of the options.
Oh, okay.
You're less fixated on predicting that perfect future outcome and more focused on building a solid rationale right now. And this generally leads to better accuracy, better calibration.
That feels intuitively right. You're kind of incentivized to do your homework properly if you know someone might ask how you decided, not just what happened. And the text connects this back to the people they spoke with, the folks actually working in the maritime industry.
Yes, the informants on the ground. They felt that this requirement to be able to justify their actions, especially maybe before they took them, was actually a powerful, positive thing.
There's that great quote from one informant, isn't there? Something like,
how can I explain what I'm just about to do?
Yeah.
That saved me many times because you think, I can't really justify this.
Wow. Just asking that simple internal question, can I explain why I'm doing this?
It acts as an immediate kind of quality control on the decision process itself.
Right.
It pushes you to maybe gather more info, double check things, make sure the reasoning is sound. It's a fantastic example of process accountability in action, potentially stopping problems before they even start.
So accountability isn't just some abstract concept or, a box to tick on a form. It really gets inside our heads and shapes how we think and decide. But it's also bigger than just what's happening internally, right? It's social too.
Absolutely. The source brings this up, talking about accountability as a social practice or maybe a relationship between people. Researchers like Roberts explored this.
Okay.
It influences how we see ourselves, our perceived identity, and it really highlights our interdependence. how our actions affect others and theirs affect us.
We don't operate in a vacuum.
Not at all.
Huh.
As social creatures, we tend to internalize the attitudes others have towards us. That shapes our sense of self, our kind of rational identity, based on both internal factors and these external interactions.
Okay.
Accountability, in this social sense, provides context. It frames our actions within a set of social expectations, implying there's some shared understanding of what counts as a rational good.
Mm-hmm.
And it requires us to be, visible in our judgments and decisions, and for those judgments to be based on reasoning that others can see as plausible, something they can understand.
So if I know I have to explain my decision to you, it forces me to make sure it's not just logical inside my head, but that it also makes sense within our shared context, our rules, whatever they might be.
Exactly. It's the link. It connects that internal cognitive process we were just talking about to the external social world we operate in.
Okay. Now let's take these ideas, the cognitive effects, the social dimension, and apply them where the source text really focuses, these maritime safety management systems, the SMS. How does all this play out in that complex, high-stakes world?
Yeah, this is where, the rubber meets the road. One big challenge raised by the people working in the industry, the informants, is that it's very easy to look at isolated systems rather than holistic, meaning you have all these different players, the ship's master, the crew, the company owners ashore, various regulators like port state control, flag state control, accident investigators. It's a crowded field.
Lots of different viewpoints and pressures.
Absolutely. And each has a slightly different perspective, a different role, and it can be really hard to see how it all fits together into one coherent safety picture. Navigating that is a huge part of understanding accountability there.
So what did the informants say about who actually gets held accountable in that system?
Well, this is a really strong, consistent finding from the source, talking to all the different types of informants. Their perception was overwhelmingly that individuals, especially the master and crew, rather than the large organizations they work for, are the primary ones held accountable for conduct, particularly when things go wrong.
Individuals take the fall, basically.
That's the perception. And this accountability is often enforced through quite bureaucratic, hierarchical mechanisms, inspections, audits, things carried out under international conventions set by bodies like the IMO and ILO.
The International Maritime Organization and International Labor Organization, setting the global rules.
Right. So a big chunk of the system is geared towards checking individual compliance against these established standards.
Okay.
However, the source also points to something really important, a potentially underappreciated resource within this whole setup, the actual expertise of the master and the seafarers themselves, the people on the ships.
Their hands-on knowledge.
Exactly. As one informant put it, masters and crews have this huge wealth of knowledge and experience built up over years, often decades, at sea. This frontline experience is it's a critical resource.
But is it being used?
Well, that's the question. The source argues it needs to be effectively captured and used by the organizations, the shipping companies back on shore, for real learning, for improving the safety systems themselves. The potential for improvement is massive, but it means embedding that knowledge organizationally, not just letting it stay siloed with the individuals on board.
Which brings us neatly to sharing information, doesn't it? And learning from events. If that frontline knowledge isn't shared effectively, the system can't really learn and improve properly.
Precisely. The source talks quite a bit about the vital role of sharing lessons learned. It highlights how individuals often change their own practices based on informal learning, just from day-to-day stuff, little details, near misses, not just formal training after a big incident.
But the text also says there's some pretty significant barriers to this kind of sharing.
Oh, definitely. One major issue that came up was simply delays. Delays in getting official information and reports out. An informant shared an example. They said, it was 2 years before we saw that report.
2 years?
Yeah. And there was things we could have learned from that accident that took 2 years to come out. 2 years is an eternity if you're trying to prevent similar events happening on other ships.
That's a serious lag in a safety critical environment.
Oh. But on the flip side, the source did mention that some second regulators, maybe like accident investigation bodies, rather than the day-to-day compliance checkers, are sometimes perceived as more proactive, more genuinely safety-focused.
How so?
They tend to share best practices, lessons learned, maybe anonymized findings more readily. And the informant felt this led to a lot of shared knowledge, less similar mistakes happening.
Yeah.
So that contrast really highlights the power of effective, timely information flow.
But the text also acknowledges that sharing these lessons, especially when something has gone wrong, is personally really difficult for shipmasters.
It is. It can feel like exposing a weakness, whether that's fair or not. It feels vulnerable.
Yeah.
And just the sheer effort involved documenting what happened, reporting it clearly, communicating it upwards, it takes real capacity, time and effort, both from the individual master and from the organization that needs to actually create the space and systems to support that sharing. It really needs commitment and underlying trust.
And you need to understand why someone made a certain decision in that specific moment,
Yeah.
right? Not just blame them. The source called it their local rationality.
Exactly. Understanding the context from their perspective at the time. If you genuinely want to learn and prevent it happening again, you have to try and grasp the reality they were facing, the pressures they were under.
Not just judge with hindsight.
Right. And this connects to ideas like dialogue, which the source mentions briefly. Seeing dialogue not just as discussion, but as a way to go beyond any one individual's understanding, trying to get a free flow of meaning, maybe even challenging the usual power structures you find in hierarchical organizations like shipping.
And what about the monitoring aspect? We talked about inspections. Can that constant surveillance have downsides too?
It certainly can. The source notes it can be positive, helping masters ensure they're meeting the required conventions, for example. That's good. But if that monitoring or surveillance is perceived as overly intrusive or purely about catching people out, purely punitive, then it can backfire. It can kill motivation. It can actually disrupt performance if people feel constantly watched or second-guessed. And it can even just overwhelm cognitive resources if it's too intense.
So it really matters how it's done and why people think it's being done.
Absolutely. The legitimacy of any accountability system, and ultimately how effective it is, seems deeply tied to the level of trust between those being monitored and those doing the monitoring, how they perceive each other's intentions.
So pulling all these threads together, the source text essentially presents accountability not as the simple, straightforward thing, but as a really complex puzzle.
Yeah, a puzzle that's kind of both mechanical and causal, you could say.
Mechanical and causal.
Mechanical in the sense of trying to figure out how it actually works. You know, why is it so easily confused with the responsibility? How did the language itself shape our understanding? What are the moving parts?
Okay, the how. And causal.
Causal in understanding its effects. How does imposing accountability in different ways impact all the different people involved? How does it influence those decision-making processes we talked about? How does it shape identity? And critically, how does it affect the ability of these complex systems to genuinely learn and improve after something goes wrong?
We started out thinking accountability was, well, just a simple word, maybe a bit bureaucratic. But we've taken this deep dive, guided by the text, and uncovered this really complex relationship it has with responsibility. We've explored how it gets processed in our minds, how it influences our decisions depending on that outcome versus process focus.
And how it functions as a social force, shaping our identity, making us visible.
Right. And we've seen how these dynamics play out in a specific high-stakes setting, the maritime industry, where individual accountability is really strongly emphasized. But that crucial organizational learning, the sharing of knowledge, it faces some serious hurdles. Delays, lack of trust, capacity issues.
It makes it clear that accountability isn't just a line item on a checklist or a legal term. It's something really fundamental that shapes who we are, how we act, how effectively our systems can learn and adapt.
And it seems to rely so heavily on these underlying factors: trust, context, a willingness to genuinely understand and communicate.
Absolutely.
So given that fundamental confusion at its core, all those intricate layers of cognitive and social impact, and the very real practical challenges to genuine learning that this text highlights, maybe consider this. Where in your own life, or perhaps in the systems you work within, might that word accountability be getting used? Maybe without a full grasp of its complex mechanics and its ripple effects? Where might a real deep dive looking beyond the surface into how accountability is truly functioning, or maybe how it's breaking down, reveal some hidden barriers? Or maybe even some surprising opportunities for genuine growth and improvement?